A little girl, just 9 years old, out one late afternoon in 1959 selling campfire mints, never to return. What happened to Candy Rogers? Who killed her? For 62 years, there have been plenty of tips, suspects, speculation. But until now, not one conclusive viable suspect.
Candy Rogers disappears while selling campfire mints. On March 6, 1959, 9-year-old Candace Candy Elaine Rogers disappeared in Spokane, Washington, while selling Campfire Girls mints near her home on West Mission Avenue. She was a fourth-grade student at Holmes Elementary School and a Bluebird, the junior level of Campfire Girls. That afternoon, Candy left her home carrying 7 boxes of mints, planning to sell them door-to-door within her neighborhood. Candy followed a familiar routine. She was expected to return home before dark, as instructed by her family. When she did not return at the expected time, her absence was first noticed by her grandfather. He began searching nearby streets, checking with neighbors, and trying to determine the last place she had been seen. His search remained limited to the immediate area, based on the assumption that she had simply gone farther than intended or lost track of time. Around the same time, her mother, Elaine Rogers, returned from a hair appointment and quickly realized that Candy was missing. The situation escalated as more time passed without any sign of her. Concern shifted into urgency as family members expanded their search, calling out her name and checking locations she was likely to visit during her sales route. When those efforts failed, authorities were contacted and police began responding to the disappearance. Officers started gathering information about Candy's movements, including the homes she planned to visit and the approximate time frame of her activity. Investigators attempted to retrace her path and identify anyone who may have seen her during the late afternoon hours. A major development occurred when boxes of campfire mints were discovered scattered along Pettit Drive near the Fort George Wright area and bridge. The placement of the boxes raised immediate concern. They were not clustered together as if dropped accidentally, but spread out in a way that suggested they had been thrown from a moving vehicle while in motion. Investigators examined the boxes carefully and collected them as evidence. One of the boxes contained a partial fingerprint, which was lifted and sent to the FBI for analysis. Despite this effort, the fingerprint was never identified, leaving investigators without a direct lead or suspect at that stage of the investigation. The scattered mint boxes provided the first physical indication that something more serious had occurred. The pattern in which they were found suggested that Candy had not simply wandered away or become lost. Instead, the evidence pointed toward the likelihood that she had been taken by someone and transported away from the area. This discovery marked a critical shift in the case. What had initially been treated as a missing child situation quickly became a suspected abduction investigation. Law enforcement adjusted their approach, focusing on the possibility that a perpetrator had targeted Candy during her route and removed her from the neighborhood without immediate detection. These early developments established Candy's final known movements and documented the initial response from her family and authorities. They also introduced the first concrete evidence indicating that her disappearance was the result of a deliberate act rather than an accident. Spokane mobilizes and the search becomes a citywide crisis. By the morning of March 7, 1959, Candy Rogers' disappearance had escalated into a citywide emergency in Spokane, Washington. What began as a family search the previous evening quickly expanded into a coordinated effort involving law enforcement, volunteers, and multiple agencies. The urgency of the situation was clear, as authorities now believed the child had been abducted rather than simply lost. Police organized search teams and began systematically covering areas surrounding West Mission Avenue, where Candy had last been seen. Officers worked alongside community members, retracing possible routes she may have taken while selling Campfire Girls mints. Neighbors joined the effort, checking yards, alleys, and nearby streets in an attempt to locate any sign of the missing child. The response from the community was immediate and widespread. Hundreds of volunteers gathered to assist in the search, and the number quickly grew into the thousands. According to reports, approximately 1,200 people participated, including police officers, sheriff's deputies, Marines, Boy Scouts, utility workers, and postal employees. The scale of the search reflected both the seriousness of the case and the impact Candy's disappearance had on the city. A command post was established near the area where the scattered mint boxes had been found along Pettit Drive. This location became the central point for organizing search efforts and coordinating communication between teams. Volunteers were assigned specific zones, ensuring that large areas could be covered efficiently and without duplication of effort. The U.S. Air Force joined the operation by providing helicopters to assist with aerial searches. These aircraft were used to scan terrain that was difficult to access on foot, including wooded areas and sections near the Spokane River. The addition of aerial support marked a significant escalation in the search strategy, indicating that authorities were treating the case with the highest level of priority. However, the search effort was marked by tragedy. Less than a day after Candy was reported missing, one of the Air Force helicopters involved in the search struck high-tension power lines while flying low over the Spokane River. The aircraft crashed into the water, resulting in the deaths of 3 crew members, while 2 others survived. This incident added another layer of loss to an already distressing situation. The city was now facing 2 crises simultaneously: the disappearance of a young child and the deaths of individuals who had been attempting to help find her. Despite this, the search continued, with volunteers and authorities maintaining their efforts across the region. Investigators also began processing tips from the public, which increased significantly as awareness of the case spread. Hundreds of leads were reported, but none provided a clear direction toward identifying a suspect or locating Candy. The absence of reliable information made it difficult for investigators to narrow their focus. Still, each tip was documented and followed up, reflecting the thorough approach taken during the early stages of the investigation. This phase of the case demonstrated the scale of the response and the level of community involvement. It also highlighted the challenges faced by investigators when dealing with limited evidence and an overwhelming number of potential leads, all while the urgency to find Candy remained critical. Discovery of Candy's body and the evidence left behind. On March 22, 1959, more than 2 weeks after Candy Rogers disappeared, her body was discovered in a remote area near Old Trails Road, several miles from her home in Spokane, Washington. The location was close to an abandoned rock quarry, away from the residential neighborhood where she had last been seen. The discovery came after 2 airmen reported finding a pair of small girls' shoes in the area the previous day, prompting a focused search by authorities. Search teams returned to the location early the next morning and began examining the surrounding terrain. Within a short time, Candy's body was found concealed beneath a covering of pine needles, branches, and other natural debris. The positioning indicated that the body had been deliberately hidden, suggesting that the individual responsible had taken steps to avoid immediate detection. Investigators immediately secured the area and began processing it as a homicide scene. The condition of the body and the surrounding evidence provided critical information about the nature of the crime. Authorities determined that Candy had been sexually assaulted before being killed. The cause of death was identified as strangulation. The method used in the crime was particularly significant. Candy had been strangled using a strip of fabric torn from her own petticoat, the garment she had been wearing at the time she disappeared. Another strip from the same piece of clothing had been used to bind her legs together. These details indicated that the perpetrator used materials available at the scene rather than bringing tools specifically for the act. Investigators also observed markings around her waist, which suggested that a rope or similar object may have been used at some point to restrain her. However, no rope was recovered from the scene. This absence added uncertainty to the sequence of events and limited the ability to fully reconstruct what had occurred. Among the evidence collected was a substance on Candy's clothing that was later described as grape-smelling gum. This detail stood out to investigators and was preserved along with other materials from the scene. Additionally, biological evidence was carefully collected from her clothing, including samples that would later become central to the case. At the time, forensic technology was limited, and investigators could not fully analyze or utilize all of the evidence they had gathered. Despite this limitation, the materials were preserved, including biological samples that would remain stored for decades. This decision would later prove critical as advancements in forensic science made it possible to extract new information from the original evidence. The discovery of Candy's body marked a decisive shift in the investigation. What had begun as a missing child case was now confirmed as a homicide involving sexual assault and deliberate concealment. The location of the body, the method of killing, and the physical evidence all pointed to a calculated act carried out by an individual who had taken steps to avoid detection. This stage of the case established the core facts of the crime and defined the direction of the investigation moving forward. It provided investigators with their first detailed understanding of what had happened to Candy and introduced the evidence that would remain central to efforts to identify her killer for decades. The Hugh Morse theory and decades of misdirection. In the years following Candy Rogers' murder, investigators focused on developing suspects based on available evidence and behavioral patterns. One individual who drew significant attention was Hugh Bion Morse, a known serial killer with a history of violent crimes. Morse had been linked to multiple murders and sexual assaults, including cases involving victims in Spokane. His background in criminal behavior appeared to align with several aspects of Candy's case. One detail that contributed to suspicion was the presence of a grape-smelling substance found on Candy's clothing. Investigators noted that Morse was known to chew grape-flavored gum, and similar evidence had reportedly been associated with other crimes attributed to him. This connection, while circumstantial, became a central factor in shaping the investigative focus for many years. Morse's known pattern of targeting victims and his presence in the region during the relevant time period further reinforced the theory. As more information about his criminal activity became known, the similarities between his behavior and the details of Candy's murder led investigators to consider him a primary suspect. Over time, this assumption became deeply embedded in the case. Despite the lack of direct physical evidence linking Morse to the crime, the combination of circumstantial details and his criminal history kept him at the center of the investigation. Law enforcement resources and attention were directed toward examining his movements, background, and possible connections to the area where Candy had been abducted and later found. However, advancements in forensic science eventually provided an opportunity to test this long-standing theory. In the early 2000s, investigators were able to extract a DNA profile from biological evidence that had been preserved from the original crime scene. This development allowed for a direct comparison between the DNA found on Candy's clothing and known samples from suspects. When Morse's DNA was tested against the recovered profile, the results were clear. The DNA did not match. This finding eliminated him as the perpetrator of Candy Rogers' murder, despite decades of suspicion and investigative focus. The result forced investigators to reconsider their assumptions and acknowledge that the primary suspect they had pursued was not responsible. The elimination of Morse created a significant challenge for the investigation. With the leading theory disproven, the case returned to a state of uncertainty. The DNA profile obtained from the evidence was entered into national databases, including CODIS, in an effort to identify a match. However, no matches were found, indicating that the individual responsible had not been previously identified through the criminal justice system. This outcome highlighted the limitations of earlier investigative methods and the risks associated with relying heavily on circumstantial evidence. The focus on Morse, while understandable given the information available at the time, had diverted attention away from other potential leads. As a result, the case remained unsolved, and investigators were left with a confirmed DNA profile but no identified suspect. The realization that the true perpetrator had never been on law enforcement's radar marked a turning point in the investigation and underscored the need for new approaches to solving the case. Other suspects and the difficulty of solving an old case. As the investigation into Candy Rogers' murder continued over the years, detectives explored multiple suspects, but none could be definitively linked to the crime. The case spanned decades, and as time passed, many individuals considered persons of interest were no longer alive, making the process of verification increasingly difficult. Investigators were forced to rely on records, past statements, and limited physical evidence. One of the suspects identified during later stages of the investigation was Alfred Graves, a resident of Spokane. Graves died on the same day Candy's body was discovered, having taken his own life by carbon monoxide poisoning inside his car. The timing of his death raised suspicion among investigators as it coincided directly with the discovery of the victim. However, despite the suspicion, no DNA testing was conducted to either confirm or eliminate him as a suspect. Detectives also examined Graves' background and behavior. Reports indicated that he had been accused of attempting inappropriate contact with women. Additionally, items found in his possession raised further concern. Investigators discovered newspaper clippings related to cases involving women and children who had been assaulted, as well as personal items such as bobby pins and sections of rope in the trunk of his vehicle. These details suggested a possible pattern of interest in similar crimes, but they did not provide concrete evidence linking him to Candy's murder. Another individual who drew attention was James Howard Barnett. Barnett had been arrested in 1960 on suspicion of committing a sex crime against a child. Shortly after his arrest, he died by suicide while in custody, hanging himself in his jail cell. His death occurred only days after his arrest, preventing further investigation or interrogation that might have clarified his involvement in any crimes. Barnett's connection to Candy's case remained uncertain. While his arrest and the nature of the alleged offense raised concerns, there was no direct evidence tying him to Candy's disappearance or death. A statement attributed to his widow suggested that she believed he may have been responsible, but this belief alone was not sufficient to establish guilt. Throughout the investigation, detectives pursued numerous leads and examined various individuals who appeared suspicious based on their behavior, history, or proximity to the crime. However, each potential suspect presented the same challenge. There was no physical evidence that could definitively place them at the scene or connect them to the biological material collected during the original investigation. The development of DNA profiling in the early 2000s provided a new tool for investigators. A DNA profile extracted from preserved evidence was compared against known individuals, including some of the previously identified suspects. These comparisons failed to produce a match, further eliminating individuals who had once been considered strong possibilities. The inability to identify the perpetrator despite extensive investigation highlighted the limitations of traditional methods when dealing with older cases. Witnesses became unavailable, memories faded, and key suspects were no longer alive to be questioned or tested. This phase of the investigation demonstrated how a case could remain unresolved despite sustained effort. It also reinforced the importance of preserved evidence, as it became increasingly clear that only advances in forensic science would provide the answers that earlier investigative approaches could not achieve. A mason jar, preserved DNA, and the return of science. The continued viability of the Candy Rogers case more than 60 years after the crime depended on a decision made in 1959 during the initial investigation. Evidence collected at the time included Candy's clothing, and one critical item was preserved in a way that would later prove essential. An investigator sealed her underwear inside a glass jar, creating an environment that limited exposure to air, moisture, and contamination. Although this action was routine at the time, it unintentionally protected biological material for future analysis. For decades, that preserved evidence remained in storage while investigative efforts relied on witness statements, suspect interviews, and physical comparisons. As forensic science advanced, investigators revisited the material in the early 2000s. Using updated laboratory techniques, scientists were able to isolate a semen sample from the preserved clothing. From that sample, they developed a DNA profile that could be used for comparison. The profile was entered into CODIS, the national DNA database used to identify individuals based on genetic information collected from known offenders. Despite this advancement, the database search produced no matches. This result indicated that the individual responsible for the crime had never been entered into CODIS, limiting the effectiveness of standard DNA comparison methods. As years passed without progress, the preserved evidence remained the only direct link to the person responsible. The case was reassessed again following developments in forensic genetic genealogy, particularly after the successful identification of the Golden State Killer in 2018. That case demonstrated that DNA could be used not only to identify individuals directly, but also to locate relatives through publicly accessible genealogy databases. Spokane investigators revisited Candy Rogers' case with this approach in mind. Forensic scientist Brittany Wright became a key figure in the renewed effort, reviewing the condition of the preserved sample and evaluating whether it could be used for genealogical analysis. The challenge was significant. The DNA had degraded over time, and the sample contained contamination that made processing more difficult. An initial attempt to analyze the sample through one laboratory was unsuccessful. The lab determined that the DNA was too degraded and declined to proceed. This setback highlighted the limitations of working with evidence that had been stored for decades, even under relatively controlled conditions. Rather than ending the effort, investigators sought alternative solutions. In 2021, the remaining sample was submitted to Othram, a laboratory specializing in forensic-grade genome sequencing. This method is designed to work with degraded or limited DNA samples that cannot be processed using conventional techniques. Using advanced sequencing technology, scientists at Othram were able to extract usable genetic information from the preserved material. They constructed a detailed DNA profile suitable for genealogical comparison, overcoming the challenges that had prevented earlier analysis. This breakthrough reopened a path that had been closed for decades. With a viable genetic profile, investigators could move beyond traditional databases and begin exploring familial connections through genetic genealogy. The preserved evidence, once limited by the technology of its time, became the foundation for a new phase of investigation. The decision made in 1959 to store evidence in a sealed glass container proved critical. Without that preservation, the biological material may have degraded beyond recovery, making modern analysis impossible. Instead, it remained intact enough to be re-examined as scientific capabilities advanced. This stage of the investigation demonstrates how the combination of careful evidence preservation and evolving forensic techniques can transform cold cases. It also shows that even when immediate answers are not possible, preserving evidence can create opportunities for future breakthroughs that rely on technologies not yet available at the time of the original investigation. Genealogy narrows the search to three brothers. The genetic profile developed from Candy Rogers' preserved evidence allowed investigators to move beyond traditional identification methods and into genealogical analysis. Once Othram completed the sequencing process, the DNA profile was compared against genealogy databases to identify potential familial connections. This approach did not produce a direct match to a single individual, but it generated leads based on shared ancestry. The results of that analysis narrowed the field of possible suspects to a single family line in Spokane. Within that family, investigators identified three brothers as potential candidates: John Ray Hoff, James Andrew Hoff, and Terry Allen Hoff. All three were deceased, and because siblings share a significant portion of their genetic material, the genealogical data alone could not distinguish which of them was responsible. This limitation required investigators to take the next step. They needed a living relative whose DNA could be compared against the unknown profile to determine which branch of the family tree matched the evidence. Among the three brothers, only one had a direct descendant who could provide such a sample. Detective Zach Stormont identified Kathy Hoff, the daughter of John Ray Hoff, as the only viable source for that comparison. He contacted her and explained that investigators were working on a decades-old case and needed her assistance. Kathy agreed to cooperate and met with detectives shortly after the initial contact. During that meeting, she voluntarily provided a DNA sample. The sample was submitted for forensic analysis and compared to the DNA profile developed from the biological evidence collected in 1959. The results of that comparison showed a strong genetic relationship between Kathy and the unknown individual connected to the crime scene. Statistical analysis indicated that the DNA from Candy Rogers' clothing was approximately 2. 9 million times more likely to be related to Kathy Hoff than to a random individual from the general population. This result placed the source of the DNA within her immediate family line, strongly indicating that her father, John Ray Hoff, was the likely contributor. Although this finding significantly narrowed the investigation, detectives did not treat it as a final conclusion. Genealogical evidence can identify family relationships, but investigators require direct confirmation linking the DNA from the crime scene to a specific individual. To reach that level of certainty, additional testing was necessary. The identification of Kathy Hoff's connection provided investigators with a focused direction after decades of uncertainty. Instead of a broad pool of unknown suspects, the investigation had been reduced to a single family and then to a single individual within that family. This progression marked a critical turning point in the case. Throughout this phase, investigators proceeded cautiously, ensuring that each step was supported by verifiable evidence. The goal was not only to identify a suspect, but to confirm that identification with a level of certainty that would withstand scrutiny. Kathy Hoff's cooperation was essential to this process. Without a living relative to compare against the unknown DNA profile, investigators would have remained unable to distinguish between the three brothers identified through genealogical research. By combining genealogical analysis with direct DNA comparison from a family member, investigators moved from an unknown genetic profile to a near-confirmed suspect. This approach bridged the gap between historical evidence and modern forensic capabilities. The case, which had remained unresolved for more than 60 years, was now within reach of definitive identification, built on a chain of evidence that began with preservation and advanced through modern scientific methods. John Ray Hoff confirmed, and the case is finally solved. To reach a definitive conclusion in the Candy Rogers investigation, detectives required direct forensic confirmation linking a specific individual to the preserved DNA evidence. After narrowing the case through genealogical analysis and identifying John Ray Hoff as the primary suspect, investigators sought to obtain a direct biological sample from him. Because Hoff had died decades earlier, this required legal authorization to exhume his remains. In September 2021, authorities secured a warrant and proceeded with the exhumation. Biological samples were collected and submitted for forensic comparison against the DNA profile developed from the semen sample preserved on Candy Rogers' clothing. This step represented the final and most critical phase of the investigation, as it would either confirm or eliminate Hoff as the source of the DNA evidence. The results of the comparison were conclusive. Statistical analysis showed that the probability of the DNA belonging to John Ray Hoff rather than an unrelated individual was approximately 25 quintillion to 1. This level of certainty effectively eliminated all alternative explanations and established Hoff as the source of the biological material found at the crime scene. Based on this evidence, Spokane police formally concluded that John Ray Hoff was responsible for the sexual assault and murder of Candy Rogers. For the first time since her disappearance in 1959, the case had a confirmed answer supported by physical evidence rather than circumstantial theory. Further review of Hoff's background provided additional context consistent with the nature of the crime. In 1959, Hoff was 20 years old and living approximately 1 mile from Candy Rogers' home. His proximity to the area placed him within immediate reach of the location where Candy was last seen. Despite this, he had never been identified as a suspect during the original investigation or in the decades that followed. In 1961, Hoff was arrested for an assault involving a female victim. According to records, he forcibly removed the victim's clothing, restrained her using her own garments, and attempted to strangle her before fleeing. The victim survived the attack. The method used in that incident closely mirrored the manner in which Candy Rogers was restrained and killed, where her own clothing was used in the assault. Hoff died in 1970 from a self-inflicted gunshot wound, more than a decade after Candy Rogers' murder. His death occurred long before advancements in forensic science made it possible to connect him to the crime. As a result, he was never investigated, questioned, or charged in relation to the case during his lifetime. The confirmation of Hoff's identity had a significant emotional impact on those connected to the case. For Candy Rogers' family, it provided long-awaited answers after more than 60 years of uncertainty. Investigators, including those who had worked the case earlier in their careers, finally saw the resolution of an investigation that had remained open across generations. The revelation also affected Hoff's surviving relatives, who had lived with a different understanding of his life and character. The identification through DNA evidence replaced that understanding with a confirmed link to a violent crime committed decades earlier. This final phase of the investigation closed one of the oldest unsolved cases in Spokane. It demonstrated the role of modern forensic science in resolving cases that had remained unanswered for generations, particularly when supported by preserved evidence and continued investigative effort. Although Hoff could not be held accountable through the legal system, the identification established responsibility with scientific certainty. The case of Candy Rogers, unresolved for more than 60 years, was finally brought to a conclusion through the combination of preserved evidence, advanced DNA analysis, and persistent investigation.